All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our third and final session on our teaching workshop on Frank Lloyd Wright and Japanese art. We are joined again today by Dr. Kevin Nute. Dr. Nute's work focuses on the transcultural significance of traditional Japanese architecture, and he is the author of Frank Lloyd Wright and Japan, as well as 4 other books on this topic. Dr. Nute received his architectural training at the University of Nottingham before working in practices in London, Hong Kong, and Singapore. He earned his doctorate at Cambridge and has been a Fulbright Scholar as well as a Japan Foundation Research Fellows at various universities in the United States and Japan. He also taught at the Muroran Institute of Technology in Japan and at the University of Oregon before joining the University of Hawaii at Mānoa, where he joins us today. And as you probably know, he is also the author of our teaching, of our curricular guide to this topic, which I know all of you have spent time digging into. He, of course, did our first session in which we discussed Frank Lloyd Wright's biography. And now in this session, we're hoping to really drill down and really complement what Dr. James Wen did in our last session to talk, really hone in on the influence of Japanese art on Wright's work in particular. So like our other sessions, we are going to be working through a mixture of the questions you submitted a few weeks ago, but we'll also pause probably every 2 or 3 questions and invite some questions from the floor. I know in every session, we've gotten a few more questions from the floor. So by all means, if you have a question, a follow-up question, or want to take the conversation in a different direction, please do so. As Kevin did for the first session, he also has provided brief written answers, which I will send out to you when I send out the recording of the session. So if the question you asked did not get answered and you didn't really want to raise your hand, you will receive at least a brief written answer from Dr. Nute. And I'm very grateful for him for being willing to do that. So Kevin, thank you so much for joining us a second time. And I look forward to our conversation today.
Hello, yeah, thank you. Do you want to, just to follow up on what David said, I'm going to try to be, for those who were here on the first session, a little more concise to get in more questions. So that's the intent. Anyway, we'll see how that goes. So David, if you would like to jump in and I assume you'll be reading the questions?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay.
So let's take 2 of the submitted questions, and then we'll see at that point if we have any questions from the floor. So the first question is from Michael Fraden, who actually sent me a wonderful picture of the Guggenheim Museum today, shorn of all of its exhibitions right now. I believe he works there, and he was showing me it empty, so there'd be a sense of what it looked like without any distractions and adornments. I thank you for that picture, Michael. His question is, how did his adoption of Japanese aesthetics and concepts of space work with his attempt to create a unique Usonian aesthetic? Was he merely trying to escape the pervasive influence of European architecture in North America, or was there more going on there? Was the open design of many of his houses, where one room flows into another, influenced by traditional Japanese buildings with their frequent use of expandable multi-purpose space?
Yeah, it's a great question, Michael. The simple answer is right, in my view, Wright's interpenetrating space is quite different from traditional Japanese architecture. And take my word in it, I look for that relationship very, very hard, and I honestly could not. So this is a good opportunity to show. Most of you be familiar that, as you quite rightly say, the sliding screens, etc. That is a difference, and Wright comments on that. But the actual configuration of spaces is not so different. From materials are different, etc. But Wright's, and I'm going to share a screen here. I hope did I get that right? Yes. So here's an example of the of Wright's interpenetrating space, and you don't find it anywhere else, and you certainly don't find it in Japanese architecture where 4 walls will come together or 2 walls will come together in a conventional way. So there are multiple parts to your question, but on the direct analogy, my view, and this is a good example, is that if there was an influence in the way that space was broken up, it was the removal of all of those temporary partitions. So that there is a relationship in the sense of it's possible to take out the fusuma in a Japanese space and make it appear to be one. And that Wright does in the Life House and in other houses. So there is it's interpretation. It's not the way that the Japanese would see their own. And certainly in the way that the walls come together, there's no overlapping of space in the same way. The only place that I would say that there's any relationship directly would be this kind of engawa space or outdoor veranda. But that's about all. So that was a multifaceted question, and I think I've only answered one component of it, but for what it's worth. David, do you want to go to the next?
Yes, I just had to unmute myself. We have a question from Melissa Cohen-Nichols, and she asks, how was Wright's style of Japanese minimalism and open concept how has it shaped modern housing in the United States? What do you think Wright would think of current trends in architecture today? So I guess a 2-part question there.
Yeah, again, I don't have an image of it, but David, you might be able to bring up, my apologies, I should have given you a heads up and I've been better prepared, but the comparison I would make would be, or the contrast would be between Falling Water, which most of you are familiar with, I hope, and Richard Neutra's Health House, built in 1929 in the hills above LA, white steel, pure international style. And then you look at Wright's Falling Water, and it does the spatial sort of gymnastics, but there is a much richer material vocabulary, stone and colored concrete. And, so Wright was showing, I think, that he could out-modern the young modernists. And I think the Japanese influence, had a profound effect in that respect. That he was a hard-nosed modernist, but materiality and bringing out the nature of materials was not something that the modernists were doing. They were trying to flatten and make pure white surfaces. So there's one difference that Wright interpreted minimalism in a more subtle way, which I could go into, but I won't. What would he think of today's McMansions? He'd be appalled. I think he'd say that they haven't advanced at all from what he described the Victorian house as a boxing of boxes. Basically, you have a box, and inside that you have boxes and boxes and boxes, and that's pretty much, I don't, follow that kind of stuff, but I think speculative houses are rather that way. And Wright approached, and both of these first 2 questions have touched upon that, so they're great questions. Approached the ground floor as one large open space that was partially shielded, but not a boxing of boxes. So the McMansions are, he'd say, nothing has progressed. So great question. All right, David, next one.
All right. We have a question. Let's do one more submitted question. And then if anybody has a question from the floor, please do the raise your hand electronically, and I'll be able to see it and recognize you. We have a lot of people on the call today, so I might not see you if you wave in the screen, but if you do the, I believe it's the reactions. Yes, if you do the reactions and then raise your hand, I will definitely be able to recognize you. This one is from Mariel Herzog, Kevin, and she asks, Frank Lloyd Wright used the traditional American farmstead design and manipulated it to incorporate more of nature into the homes that he built. The transformation of a boxed room to more open living is evident. but what other aspects of Japanese tradition and architecture did he focus on in great detail during the process? And how did he want residents of those buildings to interpret the placements of the natural world when they entered these buildings?
Yeah, the sequence of these questions is really terrific, David. Thank you for the curating, because I've kind of covered a little bit of this, but there are a couple of Japanese aesthetics that you may have heard of. There are popular books out there on wabi and sabi. I'm not going to go into those in detail, but they do relate to Wright's sensitivity to materials. Wabi, in my understanding, part of that is the honest expression of the internal kind of structure of materials, the natural pattern of materials, rather than paint wood, for example. Wright, and he describes this, would polish the wood as the Japanese do to bring out the natural grain. Likewise, sabi, the aesthetic of aging, the stonework. Wright would have argued, I'm sure, that Taliesin Spring Green has improved with age, right? They're not constantly repainting it like you would the Villa Savoy by Le Corbusier. If you don't keep painting that, it looks really bad. Whereas when materials are intended, they don't, they actually improve as they grow, moss, etc. Big difference, right? So I think that aesthetic sensitivity and sensitivity to materials, bringing out the internal pattern of materials, be it stone or wood or bamboo or even metal. And he talks about that he wrote a series of articles on the nature of materials. He doesn't use the words wabi and sabi per se, but the same principles are there. The other one would be, in terms of principles, again, I touched upon it, continuity with nature. And the place that is most obviously expressed in the traditional Japanese house is in the veranda, the engawa, that runs along one side. Now, the engawa, it has a very practical purpose. It's a corridor, but it's on the outside of the building. So it's how you would get from one room to another without going through, but it's also a place where you can hang out sort of halfway in the garden under the eaves. So the engawa in Wright's own language, there is a wide eaves. So I would say that relationship with nature is probably in Wright's work expressed in the overhanging, and any kind of interpenetration. And I'll show you some images. Let me see. Well, let me see if I can show you this. I'm not sure I'm answering the question fully, but hope you can see this. So the interlocking spaces, sure, the interior space is interlocked, right? But Wright's architecture also interlocked with its surroundings. So the corner window, you can interpret it many ways, but one of the ways I interpret that is an interlocking between the built, the cultural, and the natural, right? And just to finish that up, I think that sort of sums up Wright's, in a diagrammatic form, his view of an organic world where everything is connected to everything. Now, we all know that, right? Intuitively, but he had to express that through his own discipline of space. So this sort of geometrical, it's a simplistic diagram, but I honestly do think so. This could be an individual building. It could be, well, let me go on. It could be the relationship of building to environment, person to person, or something to do with an art form. I'm getting beyond where I intended to with that answer, but it's a great question. So do we want to take some live questions, David, or do you?
Yes. We have one more question. I'm on this topic of structures. I think it's great, but I think it's a great time to also pause to see if anyone has any live questions. So I will pause just for a minute. Feel free to raise your hand, or I guess unmute yourself and start speaking, but I'll pause for just a few seconds to see if we have any questions.
Well, while people are thinking, I'll share my screen because I didn't get to share it last week. and this is what I was going to show last week in response to the question about the landscape of Wisconsin. And I honestly I can remember, because you can see the hedgerows, right? The one on the right is Wales, and the one on the left is Wisconsin. But I think they're not far apart. You know, I'm sure that Jenkin Lloyd Jones, his uncle, would have felt very at home in the hills of Wisconsin, you know, because apart from the smaller field size, you know, it's just like home. And then another thing I missed out last week about alternatives, you know, Wright was a magpie. He learned from all kinds of different cultures, not just Japan. So when he was in Italy, in Fiesole, outside of Florence for a year, I'm sure he saw Brunelleschi's Pizzi Chapel. And I'm kind of curious about this apparently floating roof, right? There are columns, but they're in the shade. And then you come to the Hertley House, dates from much earlier. You know, so it wasn't just Japan. I put this in to remind myself as much as anyone else that, sure, Japan was important, but Wright learned from all kinds of cultures. All right, and I'll take a question.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up, Kevin, because as I was prepping for this, I found a fantastic lecture by a scholar of Korea, Robert Frauser, who talks about the in-floor heating that Wright initially was exposed to in Japan, but it's actually it's a component of Korean architecture that really wasn't that popular in Japan. Wright just happened to run into a Korean house in Japan, and that became a hallmark of many of his other works.
I can't remember, but yeah, it's in his autobiography. I think he describes, he called him Baron Okura. Okura really financed the Imperial Hotel. Very interesting character, made his money from arms sales, basically, you know, buying and selling arms in late 19th century Japan. But his name, his posthumous Buddhist name is Taisei. It's still one of the major construction companies in Japan. And his company built the Phoenix Hall in Chicago, the first Japanese. So it's all wrapped up. The same company that built the Imperial Hotel built the Phoenix Hall in Jackson Park, South Chicago, you know, so it's really interconnected. But yes, I think he describes visiting Baron Okura and saying, where's this heat coming from? And he gets shown, and the explanation is, you know, this is a Korean idea, you know, but if you've got the money in Japan, you know, very few people would have been able to do that in Japan. All right, David, if you want to.
Yeah, we have a comment from Mickey Maddox where she says, not a real question, but a thought of some of the connections between what we were talking about and also about Japanese flower arranging, ikebana.
Yeah.
And so, Kevin, thanks to you, I now have 4 new words that I've learned, which is wabi sabi, engawa, and ikebana. And I have put links to all of those in the chat, to actually the Wikipedia pages for those concepts. So if you've never heard those before, like me, you can at least get some starter information there.
Wabi and Sabi, I think your students would be kind of interested in. I have an hilarious clip from, I think it's King of the Hill, of that dreadful cartoon from, but I'll send it to David if you remind me.
Yeah.
It's about Wabi, and it's absolutely Wabi Sabi meets Texas. It's pretty funny. Right?
Okay. I look forward to hearing that, and I will definitely share that with the teachers. All right, we have a question here from Wendy Harris, to which I'm going to append my own little question, and that is, Van Gogh and Wright both had extensive collections of Japanese prints. I know aspects of Japanese culture were popular. I'm wondering how well the average person in Wisconsin or other places with multiple Wright buildings would have been able to recognize the Japanese influence. And the little piece that I want to add on to that, and you alluded, Kevin, that you think Wright would probably be somewhat appalled by modern architectural practices and how it hasn't really moved beyond what he was critiquing. I live in a typical ranch house built in 1958, which in many ways is a box in a box in a box, but there is a seamless flow from the living room to the dining room to the kitchen. And I wonder if that is maybe Wright actually pushing the envelope a little bit, not really bringing a revolutionary change, but maybe even just an evolutionary change in mass architecture?
No, you're right. I'll answer your question first. You're right. That happens to this day, that the superstar architects do something and then it's sort of knocked off and, done in a kind of half way or whatever. So absolutely, he's influenced. I never really thought about it, but absolutely he's influenced. But corner windows, for example, were not a thing, and now they are. And as you said, the open plan, that was developing. Somebody asked about where the open plan might have come from. I think that was the very first question that we didn't do, and I had a hard time. I know other architects in the 20th century, early 20th century, were doing that, the open plan. And the only place that I could think of would be any timber traditional vernacular. Anywhere in Southeast Asia, for example, there's a sort of hut kind of type, right, which does not have load-bearing partitions. It's a single span. So it's not, in many respects, that's a Japanese house. The model of the Japanese house actually came, they believe, from the tropics up to Japan, where it doesn't fit the Japanese winter at all. It's designed for a humid climate. So, that open plan, you're right, David, whether it came directly from Wright or, other architects and who'd been looking at Wright, but sure. I've forgotten the first part of the question, but I've got an answer here. Now I'm back to it. I think people would maybe have recognized superficial details, the overhang, the large overhangs. There was an assumed influence, right? Everybody knew that Wright had been in Japan and that he collected woodblock prints. So there was like, okay, well, there must have been a Japanese influence. And that's kind of where I started, is to kind of go, everybody assumes, but, then when you ask, okay, so what is it? Not so much, it's like, well, it's obvious because he was in Japan and he collected. So how was, connect the dots between Japanese prints and Wright's architecture? Long silence, So, I think there was much more assumption than actual substance to, it was very difficult, and I did it, so I know, to show, and I don't know that I'm right, no pun intended, in what I've said, but one of the things I suppose I'm most proud of is being able to connect the art to the architecture, because somebody later on asked the question, what else from Japan or, Japanese architecture? Wright admitted to nothing other than, quotes, the marvel of Japanese prints. And when I heard that, I said, yeah, sure, Frank. If ever I saw a smoke screen, that made me even more determined to go look at the architecture. And I did find one or two direct, it's like, oh, that plan is, right there, right? The Nikko Taiyuin, etc. But relatively few where you could map one-to-one. So the biggest, I suppose, discovery, for want of a better word, is how do you take a Japanese print and learn from it architecturally? And I will touch upon that. There was more an assumption of Japanese influence than genuine kind of one-to-one mapping. And I'd like to think that I contributed quite a lot to that. But there aren't many one-to-one mappings. If you look at all of Wright's buildings, there are more general influences, aesthetics and, the planning, but none of them are directly taken from Japanese architecture. He genuinely did turn them into his own language. So, there are all kinds of words for it, but I would use translation, where, well, it's a different word. It may have similar, actually, translation is not a good word because it has different meanings. Somebody asked, he blundered in there. He's not a scholar, he borrowed things without, and that's exactly accurate, I think. As an artist, he wasn't interested in scholarly accuracy or the exact meanings. He found it cool he called it an eye-minded approach, right? A visual aesthetic approach. Couldn't read Japanese, didn't speak Japanese. For him, it was pure form. So he borrowed these things, and I don't think it bothered him at all that he had a superficial understanding of those ideas, because he put them into his own language and made them something that maybe some Japanese it would resonate with. In many cases, they go, huh? You know, what, you think that's Japanese? Yeah, maybe not, you know. So it's really a new thing under the sun, you know. It may have been inspired by, but it isn't Japanese. It's Frank Lloyd Wright, you know, it's American. Sorry, I answered about 8 different questions in one go there. Sorry.
No, that's wonderful, Kevin. And I feel like it leads us very nice into our next topic, which is cultural appropriation.
Okay.
And so we have a question from Kathleen Henderson, and says, where is the line between cultural appropriation and influence? I know there was some guidelines in the curricular guide, but I keep coming back to this question. And she goes on, the curricular guide says that at the time the Europeans and Americans were collecting Japanese prints and books, the Japanese were rapidly getting rid of them because they were old-fashioned. Have there been any attempts to repatriate some of these prints that came to the West? So can you just, and I know you do a great job of this in the curricular guide, but maybe just for us again, where is that line? And then have there been any repatriation attempts?
Right. The repatriation, I think the Japanese museums have sort of gone on the market, and that's the only way. It's not like, you know, the Elgin marbles that the British Museum has selfishly held on to, you know, refuses to, you know. The prints were on the market. Wright and others, the Spaldings from Boston, you know, bought out everything, you know, and that was, Wright was very proud of that, although later on ashamed that they'd cleaned out the Japanese market, basically, in the early 1900s. And, well, you know, 20th century then. And they're all in the Boston Museum of Arts and other art museums around the United States, you know, a few in Europe. So to get them back, you know, there's not a question of they're ours, give them back. They were bought on the open market. So the only way to get prints back into Japan is go on the market and buy. And the big collections are in places like the Boston Museum, and the Boston Museum doesn't give anything back. You know? I mean, so talking of cultural appropriation, the Boston Museum, I love this because they're kind of a bit stuck up. And in 2015, they were inviting people in front of Matisse's painting of his wife in a kimono, and they were inviting visitors to the Boston Museum to dress up in a kimono and have their photograph taken. And quite rightly, I think he was Japanese, or maybe not, maybe Korean. Somebody came in and said, this is not right, you know, don't you know better, you know, dressing up in, and the museum kind of squirmed out of it, but they never took that off their program. So it's interesting that wasn't that long ago. How do we get onto that? Oh yeah, where's the line? Other people would almost certainly have a different line, but for me, I did some thinking about this. If a form is significant in its original cultural context, then I think we need to be careful with it, right? If it's an insignificant form that has, you know, that somebody from that culture says, well, you know, that's not a culturally significant form, then I don't think, you know, we're not in my view, we're not in cultural misappropriation. If nobody cares about a form in the original culture, why, you know, how's it wrong? But even then, even if it is significant, if you can't recognize it in its new context, it's like, and here it gets a bit more tricky, you know, and people may disagree, you know, that if I take something from you, like your car, and I repaint it so that you walk by it, you don't even, it's still your car, right? And you have a right to be upset with me for stealing your car. I have a theory that it's somewhat different. You know, if I'm inspired by a form and you don't even recognize it in my art until somebody points it out, for you to then get mad at me and you didn't even recognize it, you know, it's like, really? Is that I'm aware that other people would disagree, but so those are the two criteria that I sort of came to, along with a third one, which is the power relationship between the borrower and the original culture. That Japan took all kinds of things from the West, and likewise from China, but the relationship was big brother, little brother, right? And I don't know, I've never checked, but I don't imagine that the Chinese were nervous about their culture being undermined because of this little tiny new culture relative to theirs, adopting their language. They were almost certainly flattered. It's like, okay, another colony for us, right? It wasn't quite like that, but when the relationship is a dominant culture, like the West was in relation to Japan, you put those three things together: cultural significance in the original context, recognizability in the new context, and an unequal power relationship between the dominant culture and a minority culture that is having its culture, forms borrowed, or borrow is the wrong word. Nobody ever gives this stuff back, right? There's an hilarious Saturday Night Live episode on Black Panther. You should look it up. They're talking about, some of the black cast are talking about, and that's where I got that line. She says, "Yeah, we know you guys. You don't give stuff back, jazz, and all that." They go through the whole list, right? You borrow, but you don't give back, So, yeah, that's my take on it. I don't know, and again, I'm probably biased, but by those criteria, most of the time, I don't think Wright would be guilty of misappropriation, because either the form was not significant or it was unrecognizable. Most Japanese would not recognize some of these building plans because they don't look at buildings via plans. It's only when you look at the plan you go, oh yeah. But if you look at Unity Temple and you look at the Taiyuin, they're completely different building forms, right? Nor do I think in this day and age the Japanese are going to be offended, although somebody asked the question in relation to that, and Wright did talk about, in acknowledging, this is about as close as he got to it, right? The marvel of Japanese prints, but he also said that artists, even great artists, I wonder who that would be, often don't acknowledge their sources, right? And he said, quotes, "Japan is the great insulted." So that's as close as he's sort of saying to sort of a pangs of guilt that I should have fessed up a bit more. Had he done so, a lot of people would have gone, so you're not original then. You copied all this, which is a complete, so I can hardly blame him for keeping his mouth shut, because unless you're an actual designer or in art history, it's easy to believe that that's a lack of originality, when that actually is bringing things together that existed before into something that didn't exist before. That's creativity, right? There's nothing new under the sun, but there are new combinations. So again, I'm spending too much time on one answer, but it's next one day.
It's an important question, Kevin, and I think you did a great explanation. And actually, you're helping me think through a lot of things that I deal with in other contexts, and I'm sure that our teachers deal with as well.
All right, great.
We do have a question in the chat from Teresa Ilgen, who asks, could the Japanese have not seen Wright's architectural forms as being significant because they saw themselves as being better than the West? They made the choice to not entertain the similarity in form. Is that a possibility?
It's a really great question. Somewhere else in answer to at least one other question about Wright's influence in Japan, I said it was negligible. It kind of died out with his immediate disciple, Endo, right? And his grandson, or his son. Le Corbusier, ironically, mainstream brutal modernist, had a far bigger influence on post-war Japanese architecture. Sorry about the sound effects in the background. There is another new word for you, David. Nihonjin Ron is a whole genre of literature in Japan, which is about themselves. Not many cultures have a whole genre about us and why we're unique. There have been a few books, a bit dated now, that kind of push back on that, the myth of Japanese uniqueness, and some of them may or may not be. I could give you some of those, and they're dated, they're from the 80s, but there is a long history. It's not only that Japan being held up as Western Europe's other, right? Hegel's other, but counter, Japan has defined itself first in terms of the other of Chinese culture. Sure, we'll take some of your stuff, but we are going to be different. And guess what? When you say you're different from someone else, you're not thinking you're better than me. When someone says they're different, they're never saying I'm not as good as you. First it was with Chinese culture, then it was with the West. But so it is a great question, because they've defined themselves in relation to the West. And it's like any myth, the myths that we tell ourselves personally, right? You're making sense, Nobody wants to admit that they're inferior. So, there was I've forgotten the term now, but Western technology, Japanese spirit, So sure, we'll take your guns, we'll take your industrial, but actually we think we're better than you. That was really, if you read between the lines, and that was from the very early Meiji period. They were very conscious of the fact that they were outgunned, literally, right? But culturally, and people like Fenollosa and others, reinforced that. They loved that, right? It's like, well, sure, industrially and military, you're behind us, but actually, in terms of your culture, you make us look like cavemen, and that was a common Western, and they lapped that up. I mean, who wouldn't like to be flattered like that? So yes, there is a sense of we'll make up our own mind, but it's interesting. I've been writing about this recently, about Western perceptions generally of Japanese architecture, and I don't think the West has ever, just as Japan is obsessed with its own identity and uniqueness, Westerners and I'm one of them, feel an absolute right to weigh in and tell the Japanese how their architecture should be. I mean, if they did that to us, we'd go, who are you? But Westerners for 150 years have been telling the Japanese what's wrong with their architecture. That's right and that's wrong. And we don't do that with any other culture. It's a weird reciprocal, and the assumption is otherness. There's an assumed fundamental otherness between, and it can be helpful, and it can also be deeply misleading. And there is no end of nonsense written by Westerners, probably by Japanese too, where they're reading in all kinds of meanings that are not really there. Just because it's not true doesn't make it not important. We all live by myth, right? They're not historically accurate, but they have tangible, real effects, So sorry, I'm getting off topic again.
No,
David,
no, that's a wonderful discussion. I've added that term, Nihon Jinron, as well to the list in the chat. We have a question here from Anne Yeli, and she says, and you've already addressed part of this, what is Frank Lloyd Wright's influence in Japan during contemporary times? I believe there is still a girls' school he created in Tokyo. However, I wonder how his other works have or have not endured, and how he is viewed in Japan.
Okay, I'm out of sequence here, David. So I'm trying to find my.
It's perceptions of Japanese perceptions of Wright. First question.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I had a pretty short answer, and I'll try to keep it short. Wright had very little lasting impact, right, compared to Le Corbusier. And the Imperial Hotel was looked upon as, well, first of all, Americans hated the Imperial Hotel, American architects, let me put it. I mean, it was a popular place to stay, but architects kind of, looked down their nose at it as like, the knock on that was that it had, quotes, nothing to do with Japan. And Wright would have said, you're right, because it's meant to be, it's not purely Japanese. It's meant to be a called it a clearinghouse for Westerners, and but it was this unique, some would say idiosyncratic creation that could not be repeated. That Endo did a few kind of watered down versions of it, but so he really didn't have a lasting influence because he'd absorbed the use of materials, etc., but that was already in their culture, right? So somebody like Le Corbusier, for pragmatic reasons, lots of Japanese went to work in Le Corbusier's office. Several went to Wrights, to Taliesin, but you don't see that. It's very curious that he worshipped that culture, and worked there very early before. But it cuts off as soon, the moment he left Japan for the last time. That's it. It goes on. So it's kind of I think he saw it, and I interpreted as Wright returning the gift. I don't know that Japan needed the gift. It's like, I'm giving you a gift. You don't want it, I'm giving it to you anyway, and you're not going to be able to use it. It's like, it doesn't. But again, I think he genuinely thought that he'd received all these gifts, aesthetic and otherwise, from Japan and Imperial Hotel. But to be quite honest, that was a massively important commission. So the idea that, Wright definitely came off better, took more than he gave in that relationship, way more. And I think he would admit that, that the Imperial was about his career and his finances at a very tricky time. Next question, Dave.
And Kevin, just to follow up, there are a handful of Wright structures in Japan that have been preserved. Yeah. That's correct, right?
Yeah. Yes. And they're kind of hybrid between the prairie style and the textile block. There's the Jigakuin school is kind of prairie style in Tokyo. It was done for a kind of progressive couple that were educating girls, which was, not a big thing in 1920s Japan. And then there's the Fukuhara house, which looks a bit like one of the Barnsdale house in LA, stucco concrete, and that's in Western Japan. And I can't remember the others. Excuse me. I did not look at that stuff in any serious way until quite recently, and then not in a very serious way, because I was obsessed with the stuff that was coming the other way that Wright was absorbing into. And I think Wright would have had a rather difficult, it's, now I think about it, maybe that's a missing component that I should look at, because when you've learned all kinds of things from a culture, how do you then give that back without them saying, this is secondhand? Why are you giving me secondhand stuff? It's like, so I think he went out of his way to be more Frank Lloyd Wright and less, I'm guessing here. I've never really studied it, but yeah, there are a few structures. The Imperial Hotel is up in Meijimura, just the lobby, but it is kind of, I think it's worth seeing, but nothing like the original. I can't remember anyway, yes, you're correct in that.
I know that I did a speaking tour in Japan with the Wisconsin Alumni Foundation 2 years ago, and the chapter in Kobe rented the Yodoko guest house as a venue for me to speak in, because they thought, what better place for Wisconsin alumni to gather than a Frank Lloyd Wright structure. And it was an absolutely spectacular structure, and it has this wonderful jutting out patio with a sign on it that said, please no more than 10 patrons at a time on the patio, because of these engineering issues. And I thought, here is such a beautiful structure, and yet it has some of the shortcomings of some of his other work.
Yeah, if it's a private house, probably wasn't a big. I'm a bit of an apologist for Wright, I suppose, but concrete and steel. You can't get insurance for more than 100 years, and some of that stuff is getting there, 100 years. So it's reaching the end of its material. So, and also it's the private house, you're not expecting, 50 people. So I think he can be forgiven, but they've done a very expensive renovations on that house. So I'm glad you got to see it.
It was spectacular.
Yeah.
All right. Do we have any more questions? And I neglected to say, and many of you have done this, you can also just type your questions directly into the chat if you don't want to speak. But are there any questions? Are there any hands raised? If not, we will continue going down the list. And I think we are definitely going to make it today, Kevin. We are going to make it through all of the questions.
Keep going. Let's go for it.
We have a great question from Danae Rosada asking, how did post-World War II sentiments regarding Japanese influence impact Frank Lloyd Wright? In terms of Pearl Harbor, internment camps, the U.S. dropping the atomic bomb, Japanese actions in the Pacific Theater, etc. It is interesting that he had an affinity for a country during a time in which many Americans were deeply anti-Japanese.
Yeah, immediate post-war would have been tricky. I believe, I don't know if I mentioned it, but he helped to get George Nakashima, the Japanese-American carpenter, more than a carpenter, furniture maker, Nakashima. He got him out of internment. He wrote a letter. I'm not sure if it was his letter entirely, but so he wasn't afraid to stand up, even during the war, for people who were associated. He didn't cower in the corner. And then, excuse me, post-war, late 50s, and David, you would know more about this than I do, but there was a sudden shift from Japan being, this dreadful, inhuman enemy to, darn, it could go communist at any moment. So and the problem is they did such a good job of painting the Japanese as inhuman during the war, that, or at least the Japanese military. So the State Department went into a rapid charm offensive using Japanese culture to try to rehabilitate the image of Japan in the American sort of public opinion. And I can show you, so this is 50s, not the 40s, but so things like this Japanese house was built at the Museum of Modern Art, 1955, right? That's Manhattan, right? Very expensive, right? To bring that. And then in 1960, the August and September issues of House Beautiful were about Shibui. New word, David. Another Shibui, right? And that's way more obscure than Wabi and Sabi, right? 2 entire issues. And the owner of House Beauty, the publisher, was none other than William Randolph Hearst, rabid anti-communist, right? So I'm convinced that the State Department said, hey, we need the Japanese to be on our side. So, and soft power, soft diplomacy, using Japanese culture, the chrysanthemum rather than the sword thing, right? To rehabilitate that. Here's the editor, Elizabeth Gordon, with Frank, right, at Taliesin West, and they're chatting about this. And just to give you the background of this, Elizabeth Gordon, a couple of years earlier, wrote a scathing article about European international style modernism, that it was un-American. It's the threat to the next America. I don't know if it's in there, but it's absolutely, you can read the Cold War politics there directly, right? On the one hand, she's dissing that as pinko socialist, quasi-communist architecture, that kind of minimalism, and differentiating it from Japanese minimalism, which was this richer, So the former foe is now the friend, and the new foe is represented by the international style. I mean, there have been entire books written about the way, the international style has been kicked around as a political football, and some of it makes no sense. You've got the Italian fascists saying this is national, and it looks exactly the same as the thing that the German fascists are saying, no, that's communist. We don't want any of that. So Elizabeth Gordon and Wright were on the same page. Wright, of course, loved it that people like Le Corbusier and all his competitors were being trashed as, peddling communist architecture, right? I mean, that's why they met, right? Because he wrote a letter basically saying bravo, and that's how they started their relationship. A lot of other architects got really mad with her, right? But so that's the background to the post-war. There was this sudden switch, but Wright, to his credit, I think, didn't shrink away from the Japanese. He came to the support. I'm not saying he wasn't, supportive of his own government. He was very quiet about that. I think he hated war, but he came to the support of individuals during the war. And then by the 50s, late 50s, things had completely turned around, that it was a popular thing. Next question, David.
Yeah, thank you for that answer, Kevin. And if any of you are interested in exploring this further, John Dower, historian of U.S.-Japanese relations, has written 2 great books, War Without Mercy and then Embracing Defeat. The first one really details the dehumanization of Japan during the war, and then Embracing Defeat details the rehabilitation of Japan in American culture after the war. And these are 2 books I regularly assign to my undergraduates in my U.S. East Asian Relations course. And they're very, very readable, and they're incredibly informative. So Kevin just laid out here is wonderful. If you want to read 800 pages about it, well, probably 600, 300 each books, you can really learn a lot from those 2 titles. And
I'd love, if you send them out, copy me, because I'd like to, I had architecture is obviously just tiny, one little side tributary of that big scene, but that's how it played out in architecture.
Definitely. And I was also thinking, Kevin, as you were talking about George Nakashima, I was just reflecting for a moment on Wright's character, because I feel like in our first session with you, we talked a lot about Wright's character flaws, and they were indeed indeed great. But I feel like, on the other hand, the one thing about having a, shall we say, maybe more than healthy ego is those people tend to have the confidence to also call out society and not necessarily just go along when they think something's wrong. They're gonna speak up and take action about it.
Yeah, and I think that quality of loyalty is important. I think that's a very good point. Sometimes having a big ego and not being afraid of power can be quite helpful. It's insufferable most of the time, but there are times when it's like, great, we have a battering ram. He wasn't a complete kind of, terrible. There was great loyalty there, and he felt, I don't know, in battle. Many people would say, yeah, because he brought that on himself, but he definitely supported people that he felt were being unfairly treated. And he wasn't, there's at least 1 or 2 issues where he got angry with Japanese that he thought were misbehaving, there's one instance where it's kind of appalling. I think he threw some guy down the stairs or something, I can't remember the exact details, but, he put it in writing, so he judged people on how they treated him. And it wasn't that he loved all Japanese or that all Japanese loved him, and it was the same with, I think, with all cultures for him. So I'm glad you pointed that out. He had some positive personal traits as well as these flaws.
All right.
All right, David.
We are to our last question, which is from Mary Lau, who asked, what passage or section in Okukura Kabuzo's book, The Book of Tea, do you find fascinating or influential to Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture?
All right, this is great. This is my favorite book on architecture, which is not a book about architecture. it's not in its cover anymore, and it's covered in, this is the Dover edition, which they, really cheap. They don't do good binding, which is why it's lost its binding. But I'm no kidding. I use this not just about Wright. So Okakura was one of the group of 3 Japanophiles, Orientalists, if I can use that term, in Boston. And so the quotes, and I'll quote them. I'm quoting from the Dover publications, right? But these are the page numbers. So page 24, the reality of a room, for instance, lay in the vacant space enclosed by the roof and walls, not in the roof and walls themselves. And Wright quotes that or paraphrases it multiple times, And he describes that he was super disappointed because he'd thought of that, And then he describes kind of saying, yeah, but nobody put it into architecture deliberately, so I'm actually okay, So I don't know how true any of that is. The next quote would be Teaism, right? The philosophy of Chano-yu was Taoism in disguise. So Okakura has this, probably pretty eccentric view, although I respect it, that a lot of the Zen ideas underlying the Japanese tea ceremony and tea room come from Chinese Taoism, because Zen is simply Chan Buddhism, right? I mean, I was talking to a Chinese the other day, and it's, it kind of hacks them off that Japan was the last East Asian country that any of these principles reached. So all the Western interpretations tend to be the Japanese ones, right? Nobody says Chan Buddhism. They say Zen, and most of it was developed in China and came to, now that's not to say there weren't things that were developed in Japan, of course there were, but it's a very common pattern. So Teaism with Taoism, right? It's a big deal, I think, for Wright. I told you, I'm not sure, that my study of Wright was initially about Frank Lloyd Wright and Taoism. That's how important I thought it was. And then on page 24, Taoism accepts the world as it is, and unlike the Confucians and Buddhists, tries to find beauty in our world of woe and worry. I think that would have appealed to him, does to me, I suppose. And then the next one, Zenism, I'm not sure if that's a word, like Taoism is a strong advocate of individualism. Gee, somebody like Wright, reading that is like, whoa, this is a license to be this insufferable individual, right? It's like, I've got the right to be myself, I'm just like the Taoists. I'm just like Okakura. I'm just like the Chinese Taoists, They didn't obey society's rules. There are higher laws, right? So this would have been great affirmation, I think, for him to feel like, I'm not this weird, I'm just misunderstood. I'm working on a different plane. You think I'm being this egotist, but I'm actually just I'm responsible to a higher, authority to be myself, right? And I happen to be extremely gifted, so that's my first priority, So rules about social etiquette and, other things would have come a second, right? Last one, true beauty could be discovered only by one who mentally completed the incomplete. So the best description I could give would be theater, for example, where the audience is let in on the joke, but some of the characters on the stage don't know what the story is, so they're laughing, and nobody's actually, or, not actually delivering the punchline of a joke. And the argument is that then the audience is participating. They are part of this, and it's more meaningful if you actually think of the response rather than me tell you. And if I go back to some of those images that I showed earlier, if I can find them, the interpenetrating forms, in order to interpenetrate, you've got to be incomplete. So I think this is enormously important. Asymmetry, you all know about asymmetry being a characteristic of Japanese art and architecture, Ikebana included. Well, Okakura talks about that. That is an expression of incompleteness. Completeness is bilateral symmetry. And, what, from their point of view, if you've got something over here, why would you repeat it over here? You might as well just put a mirror down. Okakura talks about being in a room with some Western dignitary, and there's a portrait of the guy behind it. And it's like, for them, that's so weird, because in the tea ceremony, there's one of everything, because you're a unique individual. You wouldn't have the individual and their portrait, right? So I would highly recommend, it's a tiny book, but the Book of Tea, it's in many editions now, but best book on architecture, actually on Japanese aesthetics that I've ever read and continue to read. It's the gift that keeps on giving. Great place to finish up, David.
Yes.
Hope that was useful.
And Kevin, I'm delighted to say that at your recommendation, the Book of Tea was actually one of the texts that all of the teachers received. Right. So I see some of them taking notes. So I think some of them might have been trying to translate the page numbers of your edition. I can't remember what edition we purchased for them. And in fact, we had to purchase several different editions to get copies for everyone. The only thing that I regret is that I did not purchase an edition for myself. So I will have to go out and make that right.
It's one of those books where you read it first time, you go, that was pretty shallow, and the more you read it, and you really stop, and I go back to it all the time. It's like an old friend, I started reading it, golly, 30 more years ago, and I still go back to it for various. I was this morning, in fact, no kidding. All right, because he talks about space being reality, but he also talks about the non-existence of space to the enlightened. Right, this sort of metaphor that the tea room. I think it was like 84,000 Bodhisattvas come and visit this Buddhist saint, and you kind of go, that's going to be kind of tight, right? Not if you don't have a body, right? And for a different, I was talking about the Japanese concept of ma, which some of you might have heard of, no direct relationship to Wright that I'm aware of, but I went back to Okakura because I remember him saying something like that. Just this morning, I was writing that because there's debate on whether the Japanese had a positive concept of space. And that same old story, they set that up in a very simplistic dichotomy. Oh, the West had a positive concept of space. Japan did not. Therefore, Japanese architecture is unique, and it's got a temporal component. And I'm kind of an iconoclast. Some of that stuff is exaggerated, So, David, this has been a pleasure, absolute pleasure, as you can, I hope you can tell. So,
Kevin, as we were discussing the Book of Tea, we had one more question come in. Do you have time for one more?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so the first part of it, this is from Teresa Elgin. The first part is, how practical were his homes in the Southwest as far as staying cool was concerned, which I believe you addressed in our first video, but maybe you just want to recap that briefly. And then, was there a reason he did not construct more homes in that area? Was he more of a rolling hills guy than a mountain and desert type?
I think I covered it. If you look at Taliesin West, it's got a heavy mass and it's got lightweight shading, and that's how you, in a hot, arid climate, that's a really good environmentally responsive approach. And that book we talked about, organic architecture or sustainable. I can't remember the authors, but we were talking about it last time. I have yet to read it in any depth, but they talk about Wright's environmental kind of credentials, which are significant for why he didn't do more down there. There are a few Wright houses. There's the David Wright house. Yeah, it's a good question. I wonder if, and I know for a fact that Taliesin West, somewhat like Spring Green, his reputation went before him, and there was a kind of like, that weird cult on the outside of town, and so I don't know, what the deal was, But it seemed to be that the immediate vicinity where he lived, he didn't get as many commissions as you would imagine, but he was working for them. And that suggests to me that the negative stuff that would have been said about the fellowship, etc., would have had a kind of chilling effect, I'm guessing. I don't know, but they were pretty good environmentally. The textile blockhouses in LA, heavy mass, a lot of shaded interior, that would have worked well to keep. It's like living in a cave. It would have stayed at a pretty steady temperature. I hope that answers the question.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Kevin. And if we can all give Dr. Nute a virtual round of applause.
Thank you.
The two sessions we've had with you have been spectacular. And if you would please send along your written answers, I will certainly forward them out to the teachers. And I would love to see the link to King of the Hill, I believe it was. Or
do remind me. It's absolutely hysterical. If you read a bit about Wabi and Sabi and then read that and then look at it, it's one last thing I'm going to share with you, and I think it's in the. This is probably one of the most important diagrams relating, I think, the prints, Japanese woodblock prints, to Wrights architecture. So you got on the left a conventional picture frame, which basically says the stuff on the inside is a lie. It's an artificial representation of the outside. And then you've got the prints and Wrights renderings, where you've got items wandering from the outside to the inside and vice versa. And then you look at his plans and you've got elements, walls and trees and things that are deliberately crossing that boundary. And I think that's the most important connection that Wright made between the prints, two-dimensional breaking of the frame and prints, and the breaking of the three-dimensional architectural box. So I'm sorry, David, to bring that in at the last moment, but that's maybe one of the most important diagrams, that relates this. Otherwise, it's just a hobby. And I don't think Wright had any hobbies. It had to be directly feeding in. Sure, he sold them and and they were beautiful and he adored the prints. But he learned architecturally, I think, from them in a very direct way. Okay. So thank you, guys. I've really enjoyed talking about this stuff. If I can be of any help, then I'd be more than happy to follow up with any of you if you wish. So, David, thanks for asking me to do this. It's been enormous fun.
Kevin, it's been wonderful. And I thank all of you for also participating in this. I sent out an email earlier this week with the templates for your lesson plans. I'll send out some more information on how to submit them, but I hope that you'll continue to engage with our center in the future. I encourage you to join our mailing list so you can find out what next year's topic is going to be for our East Asia and the Upper Midwest, but we will be doing a program like this every year. And I encourage all of you, if it's of interest, to try it again and to let your friends know. And Kevin, thank you so much. This is a great topic, and I'm sure we'll be doing this again in the future.